Hey everybody, welcome back for another photography tip. Thanks for being here. Hopefully you've taken the time to pay attention to the first couple of videos and gotten your assignments in. If you haven't, make sure you go back. Number one video was kind of about light, and make sure you're using the best light possible, and make sure it's not behind your subject. So for my case, I came outside on a beautiful day. I'm kind of in the shade actually, but I'm getting nice light. The shade helps because I don't have the darkness on my face that I would if I were staring into the light, and I'm not squinting quite as much. So sometimes sitting in the shade helps a lot. But you know, if you can get outside on a nice sunny day and the sun is shining on you, obviously that's a good thing too. Number one, we talked about a few things, most notably the rule of thirds. So right now in the shot that I'm using, I'm kind of on the side on one of the thirds. If I wanted to bring Fezzik into my shot, maybe I'd put him on the other third line. Some people asked, hey, I don't know how to put those grid lines on my camera or my phone. In your settings, your phone or your camera probably has an option to turn those grid lines on, but you don't really have to play around with it too much. Close counts. So if you're not perfectly on that third line, nobody's going to know. It's pretty obvious when you try to use the rule of thirds versus when you don't. So having me over to the side, even if it's not perfectly on the line, it's probably fine. Having me in the middle of the shot, well, obviously I haven't even tried with that. So it's just kind of an approximate. So if you don't have those grid lines, don't worry about it. Just put your subject kind of off to the side. But the other thing about the rule of thirds is that you don't always have to use it. So sometimes it works, and sometimes it helps, and sometimes it does not. So we don't use it all the time. And some of the tips that I'm going to talk about today, you don't necessarily have it. The other things we talked about, making sure you have something, you know, nice to take a picture of, like I said. So Fezzik is here, and make sure you don't have a distracting background. So in the background, I just kind of have this nice little forest park thing here. The only weird thing that I'm sure is going to happen at some point is some people are going to come down, because we have this little park by the house. But it's got this little narrow windy path down to the river, and you can't really tell if anybody's down here making a photography video. So sometimes people come down thinking that there's nobody here, and then they do this awkward thing where they stand up there and pretend that it's not awkward, but it is. Anyway, so we're going to add a few more tricks to our toolbox today and kind of look at a few more ideas for making your photos more interesting. These are composition tips, ways to sort of lay out your photo and make things look more interesting. Of course, I will take some photos and I'll put some photos up from time to time, but I'm also going to show you in my video the things that I'm doing because the rules in video are basically the same as in photography. So I'll just kind of move around a little bit and show you a couple of tips and explain them, and hopefully you can have some fun with it. Okay, so in the last video I kind of showed you a shot kind of like this. It was a bit different spot on the river when we were talking about the rule of thirds. So right now I have the horizon, the river on that bottom third, and the sky takes up those top 2/3. And hopefully it looks kind of nice. I think it looks kind of good to me. And if I want to get really interesting with it, I can try to put that bend in the river right on one of those lines. That looks kind of weird, so maybe I'll do this one here. Yeah, so that's kind of nice there. So that's another one of those. But what I like about this shot is it demonstrates another technique that I want to talk about called leading and disappearing lines. And basically it's a line in your photo that kind of draws your eye along a path and makes your photo kind of more interesting. So when you look at the photo, you have some kind of line that your eyes just naturally follow without even thinking about it. So here, the riverbanks kind of funnel our attention off towards the horizon there. So we can see the path that goes up to the horizon there, and our eyes just automatically follow that path. Now, obviously, you don't have to do this with the river. It also looks really great with like a street, or especially I really like my back lane shots. I'll show you one of those. Because you can see kind of the lines converging. So sometimes the lines just lead, They kind of lead your eye up to something, which I'll show you in a second. It's just kind of happening here. Or disappearing lines. They just kind of converge off into a vanishing point off in the horizon. And this one kind of does both. This shot that we're looking at, it kind of leads our eye towards the end of the river there, and the line just kind of disappears off into the horizon. But you can also do the same thing with your subject. Okay, not the best example here, because Fezzik is kind of small, and I already told you not to do dumb stuff like this. This would work a lot better if you had a human subject, or at least something bigger. But you can see how that little staircase, that little path there, leads up to Fezzik. So our eyes are kind of drawn towards him. Again, he's not really big enough in this shot to really demonstrate it very well, but there is that obvious path, those stairs that lead us up to that point. So that's another example of leading lines that draw our attention towards something else. All right, here's one more example of those leading lines. Here I'm using a park bench, and I'm putting Fezzik on those lines, and my attention is drawn up those lines towards Fezzik's. And once again, I'm using the rule of thirds, putting Fezzik off to the side on one of those third lines. And again, you could kind of decide whether you want him to be in the bottom third or the top third. I just figured with the lines, it made more sense to have him about there, because those lines are a little bit more obviously leading to him. And you can sort of see, again, there's leading lines in the background as well. That path kind of leads up to the street there. And my attention is drawn along that path as well. So there's some more leading lines there. So the next little concept I want you to try to work with is something called framing your subject. And basically it's kind of like putting your picture in a frame. There's something that kind of goes around and creates a natural frame to your subject. Now, it could be things like standing in a doorway. You can create a great framing effect that way. It can even be kind of just standing in a hallway. You can kind of see the walls on the side and the ceiling up top. That can kind of create a frame as well. In this case, I kind of found these neat handles on the bench there, and I put Fezzik underneath one of those handles, and you can see that that black line, as well as the seat and the back of the seat, provide a neat little frame for Fezzik, and they help him to stand out more. I'm actually going to move him to that other line and see if that creates a neat effect. All right, so here's a neat example perhaps of both. I can try to get both things in one. I've got the leading lines of the bench leading me up to Fezzik, but he's also in that handle as well, so there's a frame around him as well. He actually kind of has two frames around him. There's this bigger one that's closer to me, and then the other one that's farther away looks a little smaller, and it's closer to him, so it provides a frame around him as well. So two things at once here. I've got the leading lines, and I've got a frame around my pal Fezzik. All right, so I found one more position I wanted to try for Fezzik. I kind of put him in this little culvert over there, and that creates a neat frame around him as well. So I framed him there inside of that little metal circular thing. I also happen to have him on the third line, kind of at the bottom right third line. So applying a couple of different things there to this shot as well. Another frame I kind of thought of is using these leaves to kind of accentuate Fezzik and create a frame around him. So I've got the green around him kind of on the top and on the sides, and then he kind of stands out in the middle of that. So that's one more little frame that I've created for our pal Fezzik. Okay, something else I want to talk about is something called contrast. Hopefully you know what contrast is by now, but it's basically having something bright against something dark, or vice versa. So if your subject is really bright or really white, like Fezzik is, he's dressed in white, he's kind of white looking. If you put him against a really colorful object or a really dark object, here I've kind of tried to do both, it can create a neat contrast. So I've got my really white Fezzik against that really dark green leaf, and it kind of creates that contrast. There's lots of other ways to use that contrast as well. This one here, not the most interesting photo in the world, I suppose, because there's no real subject, but I have a dark contrast of that dark tree, which looks kind of nice against the really bright sky. And you can kind of get that same effect by just looking at the horizon once again. We can see that the river and the trees are really dark against that really bright sky. So it creates that contrast, helps the two kind of stand apart from each other. Contrast, it's good. Okay, so 3 concepts to add for this next batch of photos that I want you to drop off to me. This time you don't really have to explain them. I can tell right away whether you've done it right or not. I do want you to label the photos as well. So when you drop off the file, just change the file name. You don't even have to write anything about it. If you don't know how to change the file name, just go into where you drop off your assignment in Teams and just write the picture of Fezzik is whatever. The 3 things I want to show you, or I want you to show me: number 1, leading and disappearing lines. So find yourself a good example of that. Number 2, frame your subject. Find something that can go around your subject and create that frame. And number 3, I want you to show me something with some contrast. So your subject stands out from the background, or there's some really clear distinction between light and dark in your photo, and that makes things interesting as well. So those are the 3 things I want you to try. I'll have 3 more for you in another video, but for now, there's your 3 things. Again, nice subject, nice background, and use lots of light, and have fun. Take a lot of photos. The other thing I sometimes forget to mention is, you're not just going to take 3 photos for this. Take a whole bunch and then pick your favorites to drop off. So a big part of photography is taking bad photos. Every photographer, no matter how great they are, takes way more photos than they actually use, because most of them turn out to be garbage. So when I go to a show or I go somewhere where I'm taking a lot of photos, I take like 100 photos. I'm just taking tons of photos, and then maybe I use 10 of them, if that, or 5. It's all about kind of using your instincts while you're out there taking the picture, but then looking at them afterwards and going, that didn't really work out, or hey, that one looks pretty good. So take way more photos than you need, and then just drop off 3. If you want to drop off more, hey, that's great as well. If you want to try out some new things or show me some great ideas that you have for making your photos better, that's great, do that too. But all I really need here is 3 photos, leading and disappearing lines, framing your subject, and some contrast. All right, check that out. Go into Teams, upload your photos, and press turn in, and then come on back for some more tips next time. Thanks, everybody.